Can you hear me? Let me know if you can hear me. Great. Perfect. I'm just going to wait just a couple more seconds to see if a few more people join us. Awesome. So it looks like people can see me, people can hear me. We've got some people on Facebook, some people on YouTube. That's perfect. Anybody else join us? Okay, well, so I promised in the podcast, which I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to it yet, but when I was kind of advertising this live stream testing of my software and everything on the opening of this weekend's podcast, I said that I at least wanted to cover something that I had wished I had talked about in my episode on the Ascension. But when I hit stop on the recording, I realized I should have talked about the miracle of the scarlet thread, and I totally did not think to do it. And I can't remember if we have talked about this miracle before in the podcast previously, but it relates really well to the Feast of the Ascension, because if you remember, if you listened to the podcast for last weekend and you remember, the Feast of the Ascension really is Jesus fulfilling the Jewish Day of Atonement. In Hebrew, it's Yom Kippur. And the reason for that, and the way in which we see that correlation, is that on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, the only day on the Jewish liturgical year, and the only day in the year, period, when somebody was allowed to enter the Holy of Holies, so the innermost chamber of the temple, and that the only person that could do that was the high priest. The day that took place was on the feast of Yom Kippur, and on that day, what that feast celebrated was God's forgiving the people of Israel for all of their sins for the past year. And what's fascinating is that tradition developed during the celebration of the Day of Atonement, in which the probably some of the Levitical priests, I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming some of the Levitical priests, once the high priest entered the holy place, I'm actually gonna let me pull up a picture here for you. So you've maybe seen this before. This is an image of the temple in Jerusalem. And sometimes when people refer to the temple, they refer to like the whole Temple Mount, but specifically the temple refers to that big building there. And when you enter that big building, which is the temple itself, it's divided into two sections. And so the first section where you would first enter is called the holy place. And then when you keep going into it, you get to the big veil that you hear is torn in the Gospels. That's the veil that they're talking about when Jesus dies on the cross. The veil is torn, and the high priest would only go through that veil into the Holy of Holies one time a year, and it was on the Day of Atonement. And so, I wish I could use my cursor to show you, but if you look closely there at the front, you could barely see them, but there are golden doors. And so when the high priest would enter into the holy place to enter into the Holy of Holies, taking with him some of the blood of the sacrifice and incense, which some scholars have even said, if the high priest was entering the Holy of Holies with incense, he would have had a sort of cloud around him. So it's kind of interesting because Jesus ascends into the real Holy of Holies, right? On a cloud. And at his ascension, he makes atonement for our sins by offering not the blood of animals, but the blood of himself, right? And so when the high priest would go in to do this, to complete this ritual, the priests would tie this scarlet cord around the handles of the door, and there was this miracle that would take place every year in which the scarlet cord, so the red cord, while the high priest was in the Holy of Holies completing this ritual to atone for sin, that cord would turn from red to white. And I actually wanted to read from you just a little tiny bit from this book called "Salvation is from the Jews." It's by Roy Schoeman, who was Jewish and converted to Catholicism. He says both the Talmud and the Zohar, so these are Jewish texts, contain accounts of how in the days of the temple, the high priest would once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, enter the Holy of Holies and offer sacrifice for the atonement of the sins of all Israel. Both mention the miracle of the scarlet thread, in which a scarlet thread would miraculously turn white as the sign that God had accepted the sacrifice. And then Roy Schoeman goes on to quote directly from the Zohar, so this Jewish text. It says, "All the sins are taken away on this day, the defilement of the soul and of the body. All that day, God makes atonement for Israel and purifies them from all their sins, and they are not accused before him. On this day, the priest makes atonement for himself and his house and the priests and the sanctuary and all Israel. They used to know by a certain thread of scarlet if the priest had been successful. It was known by the thread changing its color to white. Then there was rejoicing above and below. If it did not, however, so if it did not turn white from red, all were distressed, knowing that their prayer had not been accepted." So the sign for the Jewish people that their sins had been atoned for was the changing of this cord, this thread from red to white. And it sounds like from this Jewish text that didn't always happen, and that really concerned the people, as you can imagine, if they didn't have this confirmation of God's forgiveness of their sins. But the texts go on to tell us, specifically the Talmud goes on to tell us that there was a long period of time in which the thread stopped turning white. In fact, the thread did not turn white from red for 4 decades. And the 4 decades in which the thread did not turn white was the 40 years, according to the Talmud, the 40 years leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. Which you might be like, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, if you know a little bit of history and you can do a little bit of math, the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem happened in 70 AD. So you subtract 40 years from that and you get 30 AD. So the thread stopped turning from red to white. In other words, the Day of Atonement, that cultic Jewish feast, stopped being efficacious right around the year 30 AD, which is right around the time that we believe Jesus died on the cross and then ascended into heaven and actually fulfilled Yom Kippur completely, and still does, because he entered once and for all. He doesn't need to enter every year. He entered once and for all, not with the blood of animals, but with his own blood. And that's so he continues to atone for our sins. So that's the miracle of the scarlet cord that I didn't think to share with you in our podcast on the Ascension, but I still wanted to share it with you somehow. And then when I was like, I need to share something on this live stream so I can test it out, I thought this is a perfect place. So if anybody's just now joining us, I'm Katie Patrizio, and I'm just testing out my live stream software because I'm getting ready to do a Bible study on June 10th for 4 consecutive weeks on the book of Acts. And to kind of test out my live stream software, just going to do a little bit of Q&A. So I got 3 questions, which is great because I don't want to take up too much time here. Just make sure everything is running smoothly. And if at any moment there's any hiccups, it's actually really helpful if you drop a comment for me. So that I know, because the main reason I am doing this is to test out my software. Okay, so let's just jump right into questions for us. Let's see. This question comes from Natalia and Vivian. They're from California. Natalia writes, "My 6-year-old wants to know who God's mama is. She knows that Blessed Mother is Jesus's mama and that God and Jesus are the same person, but she also knows that no one can be born without a mama. So how was God born and created the earth if Jesus wasn't created yet?" And for everyone in the audience, Vivian is 6 years old. So that is a pretty big kind of thing to be contemplating. So the question, I think, it's a big question, but the question as I was contemplating it is kind of twofold, because as I was reading it and I came to the question that is that kind of initial question, which is just who is God's mom? The simple answer and the very correct answer is that Mary is. And this was actually the source of a big debate in the early church. So the Council of Ephesus, which met in the 400s, it was a ecumenical council, which means all the bishops of the world gathered together. The Council of Ephesus spent a long time debating and theologizing about the Greek term Theotokos, which means essentially mother of God. I guess literally translated, it means like God bearer. And the debate was, can you call Mary the mother of God? And the answer that they came to is yes. And the reasoning is very simple. Mary is the mother of Jesus, and Jesus is God. Therefore, Mary is the mother of God. But that does not mean that Mary is what you might say co-eternal with God. So if there's a question about who is God's mother, and we answer that, there's this other question that's kind of embedded in here, and it is who generated God, and I think that's part of what Vivian is trying to get at. And the answer to that is that no one generated God. So when babies come into the world, they come through a mother. And that's just because that's how God set it up to be. And it's a very beautiful reason why God set it up this way. He wanted us to have a part in creation with him. So it's possible that God could have decided that every time he wanted to create a new human being, he could have just kind of literally like dropped them out of the earth or out of heaven onto the earth, and they could just appear. This is how angels came to be, right? But God wanted to allow humans to partake in his creation. We have a term for that. It's called procreation. And so humans are brought into the world. They are even in a way generated through the help of the mother. And this is even the same with Jesus as far as coming into time and coming into history and becoming incarnate. But it does not apply to him insofar as his actual existence. So if the question is, who generated God? Like, how did God come to be? He never came to be. He has always existed. For all eternity, he has existed, which is a great mystery and very difficult to comprehend. And we shouldn't be bothered that that's difficult to comprehend. So one of the reasons that it's difficult to comprehend is because we don't know people who have never had a beginning. All humans have a beginning. And so when we don't observe things in day-to-day life, they can become hard for us to imagine. But the truth is that God has no beginning and nothing generated him. He has always existed. And so in that way, he does not have a mother. He has just always been, and he always will be, which is really hard to contemplate. So it seems maybe like a simple answer, but it's certainly hard to comprehend. And so who is God's mother? Well, the mother of God is Mary because Jesus became incarnate. But God does not have a source of generation because he is God, which means he's always existed. Big questions, Vivian. Good job. You might be a theologian one day, so I applaud you. Okay, next question. This question comes from Rose in Dyersville. Why do the Protestants say there is a tomb outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? So I'm guessing the tomb that you're referring to is what's often called the garden tomb. So like if you just Google garden tomb, it will come up, articles, Wikipedia about this tomb in the vicinity of Jerusalem that some people do claim to be the tomb of Jesus. And if you go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, especially with a Protestant pilgrimage group, they will likely take you to the Garden Tomb. I'm not an expert on the history of the Garden Tomb, but what I do know is that it was not a place of pilgrimage until the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then if you read, so the Garden Tomb became famous because of an archaeologist with the last name of Gordon, General Gordon. And so some people will refer to the Garden Tomb as Gordon's tomb. But he wasn't the first person, he wasn't the first archaeologist to propose this. There were other archaeologists a little bit before him who proposed the Garden Tomb. And if you read some excerpts of their writings, like one archaeologist, for example, says that he just can't imagine the Holy Sepulchre really being the place because the Holy Sepulchre has a lot of fighting in it. So it's got different Christian factions that have different places, sections of the Holy Sepulchre. So for example, because you might be like, I don't know what you're talking about, Katie. On Mount Calvary, which is also in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because Golgotha and Jesus' tomb are very close together. On Mount Calvary, there's two altars and two chapels. One is, I think, an Orthodox chapel, and the other is the Roman Catholic chapel. And Roman Catholics are not allowed to celebrate Mass at the Orthodox chapel, even though the Orthodox chapel and the Orthodox altar is directly over the rock of Calvary. So there's things like that. There's a lot of division, and there's even stories of actual fist fights breaking out between like priests and monks and stuff. It's pretty embarrassing, I will admit. And you could see how a Protestant would be really bothered by this. There's also a purported miracle that occurs every year at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on the Orthodox Easter, in which supposedly one of the priests will go into the edicule that actually contains the tomb, and supposedly his candle will ignite miraculously by itself, and then he comes out and he ignites the candles of everyone else. But apparently it's quite a scene that doesn't always feel very respectful, and so people are pretty scandalized by that. Anyways, I'm giving you a lot of backstory as to why some Protestant scholars and pastors and archaeologists are a little bit turned off by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Another reason why they're a little bit turned off by it is that they have no place in it. And when I say that, I don't mean like they don't belong in it, but the Roman Catholics have a section, the Greek Orthodox have a section. There's other Christian denominations that have sections of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Protestants don't have any section, and so in some ways you could see how they'd feel a little like they don't have a place. All that goes in to say that some of the early archaeologists who started looking for other places thought that there's not a lot of solemnity at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre always, so could God really have actually died and risen there? My opinion is that's not a very scientific reason to believe that that's not the archaeological site of Jesus's passion, death, and resurrection. But nevertheless, they started looking for other places in the area, late 1800s. They found this kind of rock outcropping that if you kind of look at it from certain directions, looks like it could be a skull. They said maybe that's Golgotha because it kind of looks like a skull. Then after a few years of investigation, they found some tombs nearby. One was kind of by itself, and so they've kind of decided that that might be Jesus's tomb. But not all Protestants say it is for sure Jesus's tomb. I have heard some Protestants who have gone on pilgrimage to the Holy Land say that their guide takes them there because it's a place that's kind of better for meditation, potentially, because there's not a big church built over the tomb. You can kind of see it for how it probably was in the first century. Personally, I don't find that super compelling because I've been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and I did some of the best meditating I ever have in my life by sitting on a bench directly across from Jesus's actual tomb. And even though there were crowds of people around, I mean, I could look and say, that's where Jesus rose from the dead. So I can see maybe why some people go there on pilgrimage. Let me talk really briefly about the kind of archaeology behind it. No serious archaeologist believes that Gordon's tomb or the Garden Tomb is the burial place of Jesus. And there's several reasons for that. For one, the tomb that they'll often take you to has been dated to like the 7th, 8th century BC, which you might say, well, Katie, I don't see how that precludes it from being Jesus's tomb because it was, hewn before Jesus's time. If Jesus was first century, 7, 8th century BC, but it contradicts the Gospels because the Gospels are clear that Jesus's tomb was a new tomb, and people don't realize this, but in first century Jewish practice, tombs were reused. So you would place someone in the tomb, you would allow the body to decay, and then you would gather up the bones, put them in a coffin, and move them elsewhere. So there's no way that that they would have hewn a tomb in the 700s BC and then not used it until the first century. That'd be like building a house and then not using it for 700 years. That's crazy. So it would contradict the Gospels that say Jesus was laid in a new tomb. The other thing that they'll point to try to bolster the idea that the Garden Tomb could be Jesus's tomb is the presence of, I believe, a wine press nearby, because the Gospels may allude to that. But archaeologists have dated the wine press to the Middle Ages, so that debunks that theory. The biggest reason archaeologists believe that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is actually where Jesus was laid, died, and was laid. I just got dropped. Is everybody still with me? Let me know if the new live stream is up here. Okay. Sorry. This is why we're doing this, so this doesn't happen in the middle of a Bible study. Okay, so I was talking about the biggest archaeological reason for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre being the actual place where Jesus was laid, was died, buried, rose from the dead, is because there's evidence that in, I think, the 2nd century, maybe the 3rd century, maybe the 300s, you can hear my laptop fan. Okay, I think I had 2 microphones on. That should be better. Thank you. Let me know if it's still loud though. One of the Roman emperors basically bulldozed the site and built a temple, a pagan temple, on top of the site of Jesus's death and resurrection. And this was common practice in Roman culture, to go to a place that had like liturgical or cultic significance for another religion and just bulldoze it and build a pagan temple on top of it. So, for example, the Romans did this on the Temple Mount as well. They like practically bulldozed the temple. Well, it was already destroyed in 70 AD, but they built a pagan temple on top of it. So archaeologists point to the archaeological presence of this pagan temple on the location of Golgotha and Jesus' tomb as confirmation that that is indeed the place where Jesus did die, was laid, and rose from the dead. So that was kind of a long answer, but it's a really fascinating topic, and I love talking about the Holy Land and archaeology and all that jazz. So that is why, in a nutshell, the Protestants say there is a tomb outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. All right, and then last question. This one comes from Genevieve, who's in the Des Moines Metro, where I am. She says, I'd love to hear more about today's reading and your take on Peter and his phileo love and how that corresponds to his yes, and by extension, our yes, as opposed to Mary's yes. So the reading from today was from John 21. And the story that Genevieve is referencing is Jesus kind of facilitating a threefold confession for St. Peter. So it's the story where Jesus says to St. Peter, do you love me? St. Peter says, yes, Lord. And Jesus asks him again, do you love me? Yes, Lord. And Jesus asks him a third time, do you love me? And we're told that Peter's troubled at that point, but he says, Lord, do you know all things? You know that I love you. And what Genevieve is referring to is something that I've talked about before in other talks that I've given, is that there appears to be a really fascinating kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, anyways, Jesus just he alternates between different Greek words for love in this gospel. And some theologians have pointed out that there's possibly something here. So Jesus actually says the first time, do you agapao me more than these? Which is agape love, right? And then the second time he says, do you agapao me? And then the third time Jesus says, do you phileo me? Which some people have said is kind of a lower form of love. Now I'm going to let you into a bit of like inside Catholic Bible scholarship argumentation. I was hesitant when I gave that talk, and I've used that gospel. I've reflected on that gospel at various times in my talks. And I've always been a little bit hesitant too, because there's quite a bit of argument that Jesus is not using different Greek words on purpose. Because there's other places in John's gospel where John has Jesus using different Greek words. And kind of just like when we talk, sometimes we'll use synonyms so that we aren't saying the same words over and over again. In fact, that's kind of a sign of fluency in a language when you know lots of different ways of saying something. And so this was an argument recently, actually, on a Catholic Bible scholar blog, whether Jesus actually meant different things by the different uses of words. I felt comfortable employing that idea of Jesus specifically using agapao and phileo and kind of contrasting them, because Pope Benedict brings it up in one of his papal audiences, and he himself takes the view that Jesus intentionally did that. And so I'm like, well, Pope Benedict says it, I'm going to jump on the bandwagon. And obviously you have to understand that when he gives his Wednesday audiences, he's not speaking infallibly or something. And Pope Benedict is a Bible scholar, so he's just kind of thinking. This blog, who's written by a professor of mine, says, I think Pope Benedict changed his mind because when he wrote Jesus of Nazareth a little bit later, he never mentions that. I don't know, because Pope Benedict seems to never mention that gospel at all. And so I don't know. He doesn't specifically correct himself. All to say that I have second thoughts about putting too much weight on that biblically. But nevertheless, I think the theological idea stands, which is even if you can only love the Lord poorly, so like even if you can only phileo him, he's still satisfied with that. Insofar as you give yourself to him completely and you allow him to transform you. And it's an interesting idea because Genevieve here says, how does that correspond to his yes and by extension to our yes? And then she says, as opposed to Mary's yes. Now, I don't know for sure, Genevieve, what you mean by that. But I would say that Mary's yes is no different than our yes insofar as the kind of yes that she can make. So her yes is very different from ours because her yes is arguably the most freely given yes ever because she freely gave everything to God. She freely gave herself to God. That's why she's the holiest human aside from Jesus, right? So her yes was different, and yet at the same time, it wasn't different. And what I mean by that is we have the same capacity to say yes. And the reason that Mary was able to give herself freely to God in that situation, when the angel came to her and said, "Will you be the mother of God?" is because previous in her life, she had been completely open to him giving her grace. And so that prepared her even more and more and more to give a full yes. So the more free you are, the more full your yes is. And Mary was completely free. And we become more and more completely free the more we say yes to God. So that's kind of an answer and a non-answer to the question. But it's a great question, and I just let you a little bit into some of the arguments in Catholic biblical scholarship. And in part, if, Dr. Barber is listening to this, I want him to know that I hear him out, and I heard him out when he's like, don't say that Jesus is making a comparison and a contrast of phileo and agapao. That is the third of our 3 questions. So again, if anybody is tuning in, I'm Katie Patrizio, testing out my Livestream software. We're just doing a little bit of Q&A. Any last minute comments or questions from anybody that is tuning in currently? And by the way, if you are currently tuned in or did tune in to help me check things out, I'm really grateful. So thank you. I appreciate that a lot. Any final thoughts or questions or anything like that? Anything at all? Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry it dropped there for a second. I'm glad it looked like it came back on. And hopefully we'll have better luck with live streaming our Acts Bible study. So it's going to be a 4-session Bible study on the book of Acts. It's going to be entirely online, live streamed on my Facebook page and my YouTube page starting June 10th, 7 p.m. Central Time. So it'll run June 10th June 10th and June 17th, June 24th. And then the last session will be July 1st. And I'm going to go off here, but the recording should stay. If you have any questions, leave a comment. Shoot me an email. Listen to my podcast, sundaydive.com. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. Have a great weekend and a very blessed Friday.